hopefully is looking to be at very best a rotational big, but at least he is a rotational big. They traded them to the 76ers for Alfred Payton, for the draft rights to Alfred Payton, who we all know was traded this year for a second rounder at the trade deadline, showing you how he has developed with the Orlando Magic. So they essentially traded away the Aaron Fox, Dario Saric, and Willie Hernan-Gomez for Alfred Payton. What does that tell you about the Magic and this trade? How quickly they lost it right here.
Well, the Magic just don't know how to draft. They took a swing at who they thought would be a franchise player in Alfred Payton, and he obviously turned out not to be the right guy. I think the biggest problem with the Magic's reasons why they've struggled since the Howard years is because they've failed on drafting. They haven't drafted correctly. And it's obviously, Alfred Payton's not their only miss, right?
Not at all.
Pizzonia, there's other misses in here that there's players that they missed out on. They made that trade for Serge Ibaka, where they got rid of probably their best draft pick. Obviously, again, in hindsight, we're talking about because Victor Oladipo wasn't that player, but they kind of gave up on him a little bit too early.
And Sabonis.
Yeah, they kind of gave up on these players a little bit too early. So that's why I think, it shows why Orlando Magic have continued to struggle. I think the past 2 years they've improved a little bit, and hopefully their picks pan out. But we will see.
We'll see. Yeah, even Mo Harkless, who literally when he was traded to the Magic had not played a game yet. He had just been drafted as the 15th overall pick, and he played 3 years with the Magic, and then they essentially traded him for nothing. And then he became a rotational player for Portland. Never, not even an above average rotational player, but a rotational player at the very minimum. So, again, a disaster of a trade when we look back at it now. They did receive Vucevic, was the only real player who's panned out for them. And even he has had a lot of injury issues playing for the Magic. So, he's averaging about 66 games a year in the 6 seasons he's played there, which you're missing about 15 games on average in a season. That's not good. So, trade that I remember thinking this at the time too. I really wanted this trade to occur because I thought it made perfect sense at the time too. Would have been Dwight Howard for James Harden and Serge Ibaka. Now, this was the year Dwight Howard's back issues were slowly starting to become a problem. Now, nobody knew what it would become to yet, but everyone there was small doubts about what Dwight Howard's future was because of the back problem, but it wasn't big yet. And the Thunder knew, essentially, that they were not going to keep both James Harden and Serge Ibaka. Now, at this time, it was because of the fact that the salary cap had not become what it is today yet, and they were very concerned about the luxury tax. They knew that unless James Harden took a pay cut, Serge Ibaka had taken a pay cut, but unless James Harden took a pay cut and signed an extension with them for a little cheaper than what he was worth, he wasn't going to be there anymore. Which, essentially, James Harden would not take that pay cut later on and was traded to the Rockets. So, real quick, I want to look at what each player was doing in 2011-2012. James Harden was 22 years old, played 62 games, did not start, but played 31 minutes a game, made nearly 2 3-pointers a game, 40% shooting, averaged four rebounds, 4 assists, and a steal per game. He had won the 6th Man of the Year award that year. Ibaka was 22 at the time as well. Played in 27 minutes a game, 9 points, 7.5 rebounds, 3.7 blocks, which is just absolutely ridiculous, and was first team all defensive, obviously with those type of blocks numbers. So, however, again, they knew they could not keep both. So I think making this trade for Dwight Howard, who was coming off a 20-point, nearly 15 rebounds a game, steal and 1.5 steals per game, 2 blocks per game in 2011-2012, was an All-NBA and All-NBA first team and All-Defensive first team player. Definitely still an All-Star. So let me touch real quick on why I think this trade would have been good in hindsight for the Thunder. So again, we're going to focus on 2012-13 and 2013-14, specifically 2013-14. So Dwight Howard, over the next 2 years, playing on the Lakers and the Rockets. He still played in 76 games in 2012-13 and 71 games in 2013-14. So he was still playing a majority of the year. He averaged, over those 2 years, he averaged about 17.5 points, 12 rebounds, a steal, and 2 blocks. Okay, he was an All-NBA third team player in 2012 and 13, and All-NBA second team player in 2013-14. And his teams still won 45 and 54 games respectively. So his teams were still winning with him there. Now let's touch on this 2013-14 seasons for the Thunder. In 2012 and 13, they won 60 games. And this was their first year with Kevin Martin. They had pulled off the trade right before the season started. James Harden for Kevin Martin, Jeremy Lamb, and some draft picks, which actually later became Steven Adams. So that was, at minimum, a good pick for the Thunder. However, he wasn't much of a rotational pick for them at the time. Martin had one good year with the Thunder. He made about 2 3-pointers a game on 43%, which is good. Didn't contribute much else. But he had one good year for them in 2012 and 13, and then left, then was traded. So he did not play for them in 2013-14. Similarly, Lamb and Adams, even though Adams became a solid player, did not contribute much for the Thunder in 2013-14. Serge Ibaka had good years for them. However, it seems like Dwight Howard might have been a little bit of a better player still at this time. Now, after that, he dropped off a lot after 2013-14. However, I really want to focus on this year for the Thunder. So they had won 55 games in 2013 and 14 and made it all the way to the Western Conference Finals against the Spurs. Now, this is the Spurs team you had mentioned that was absolutely, especially in the playoffs, just looked absolutely ridiculous. They weren't going to get stopped. Kawhi Leonard had finally become, like I said, an all-world player, won the MVP that year in the finals. However, I want to touch on this series between the Thunder and the Spurs, and then let me preface it with some numbers too of where now the Rockets in 2013-14 were ousted in the first round. However, let me give you a quick recap of what Dwight Howard did for them in that year's playoffs. In that year's playoffs, he averaged, now this is only over a span of 6 games, he averaged 26 points, 14 rebounds, and 3 blocks a game, nearly 3 blocks a game for the Rockets in 6 games. Ibaka, in that series, missed games 1 and 2, which were both blowouts by the Spurs. The Thunder ended up winning games 3 and 4. Spurs, again, blew out the Thunder in Game 5, and Game 6 went to overtime. So Game 6 was a hard-fought game. Now, my question to you is, I need you not to be biased, which I believe you won't be. Do you think that with Dwight Howard as the center, the Thunder could have won one of either games 1 or 2 against the Spurs with Dwight Howard inserted in the lineup, playing like he was in those playoffs? And do you think they could have won one of games 1 or 2 to essentially take 3 of the first 4 games of the series? And do you think they could have taken this series and gone on and beat the Heat?
I believe that's a hard question. My biggest worry there is the fit of Dwight Howard playing with Russell Westbrook. I don't. Again, I'm a Russell Westbrook hater, and I don't think adding Dwight Howard, who is not a good locker room guy, who isn't the best work ethic, is the best mashup there. When I think about it defensively, and I'm just thinking about those Spurs games in the past, what they really relied on is their passing that year. It was called the beautiful game. They were able to pass the ball around. You have a good shot, but you pass it for a better shot. So my first thought is, I actually don't think that defensively he would make much of a difference. Now, that is kind of a ridiculous take, because I was thinking about it because, Tony Parker really relied on his driving. I mean, Tony Parker was still the vocal point of the offense for the Spurs that year. Kawhi Leonard hasn't developed yet into the offensive player that he is the next few years. So they still are, they're counting on Tony Parker being able to beat his guy off the dribble, go to the lane, and then Dwight Howard being there. Well, yes, that can probably make a difference. So, maybe it would change the game around. I do remember those games 1 and 2 were pretty much blowouts, and there was at times that Spurs offense to me seemed like it was pretty hard to stop. I mean, even a very good defensive team like the Heat that year were unable to stop the Spurs pretty much at all that year. I mean, maybe in one game. So I that's a good question. It's one of those what ifs that would be very interesting to go back on. Because I probably would say right now I'm at like 60-40 thinking that the Spurs would still win that series.
I actually agree with you. I just think they Thunder would have put up a much better fight. I mean, I believe Game 2 Spurs blew them. I believe I seen 117-77. And I think Game 5 they won by about 30 points, which is both absolutely ridiculous.
And those blowouts were for the Spurs that year, besides the first round series against the Dallas, which was actually remarkably that one went to Game 7, which was probably the Spurs' toughest series of that playoffs. But they blew out the Heat a few times by over 20s. They blew out their second round team, which I believe was Portland. Did they play? I could be wrong there.
Not even sure, yeah.
But they just they were blowing out teams that year. And I honestly think that Spurs team was kind of unbeatable for that 1 year. And they beat some really good teams. So, I mean, this trade would be an interesting trade at the time because of, the Thunder get a little bit better. They get more return for James Harden. It'd be interesting to see if the Thunder actually made, in my opinion, which would have been the smarter choice of getting rid of Russell Westbrook in the deal instead of James Harden. But back then, that wasn't something that you can actually think of.
Plus, he's the only one who stayed with the Thunder still. But yeah, and I think it would have depended on how well Dwight Howard would have continued playing. I mean, like I said, putting up 26 points and 14 rebounds and 3 blocks in 6 games is not easy to do. And those are some real good numbers. A very small sample size, but also 6 games is nothing to. 6 games in a playoff series is nothing to look down upon. So it would have been very interesting. It would have been interesting to see how Ibaka playing in Game 1 or 2 would have affected that series too. But that's why we're allowed to look back and say what if, but it doesn't really matter because the Spurs ended up winning that series and winning the championship. So it really doesn't matter at this point. But yeah, so quickly to recap again what happened in this trade. Philadelphia 76ers traded for Andrew Bynum, who was 24 years old and looking like a franchise-type center, never played one game for them. They ended up having to rebuild over the next 3-4 years, essentially, so definitely lost this trade, a huge loss for them. The Magic ended up trading, not the Magic, I'm sorry, the Nuggets ended up trading for an all-star small forward and Andre Iguodala, traded a first-round pick and a couple of rotation players for a player who only played 1 season for them and Bolton in free agency. Definite losers in this trade as well. Lakers traded for an all-star center who Bolton in free agency after 1 year, another loss. And the Magic traded for a slew of draft picks and a couple of young players who never panned out into the players they were hoping to be, and the draft picks ended up being great draft picks who they just all traded away for another player who didn't pan out the way they wanted him to. So I guess the winners of the actual trade are the Magic, pretty much by far. But then they made another bad trade 2 years later that really has made this trade into a complete wash for all teams in a very negative way. And really, with 4 teams losing it, could go down as one of the worst trades in NBA history in terms of all the teams involved. So, yeah, this was a lot of fun research to see how bad this trade was.
All right, so we're going to get going now. Thank you for listening. As always, please follow us on Instagram at NBA Trade Zones. Our Twitter page is also at NBA Trade Zone. And our Facebook page is NBA Trade Zone. You could email us at NBA Trade Zones